Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The graveyards of England in the middle years of the 14th century were not quiet places. They were crowded, overused, and smelled faintly of decay. Not in the dramatic way popular novels might suggest, but in the slow, lingering presence of damp earth and human matter buried in soil that was never given time to rest. The towns of England, from Norwich to Exeter, were dotted with churchyards that held centuries of the dead, layered and stacked beneath ancient yews. But these weren't peaceful resting places. They were work sites, and sometimes sites of panic. If you were to walk into a village churchyard during this time, especially following the waves of the Black Death, you would not just find tombstones and fresh mounds. You would find odd contraptions next to certain graves. A rope running through a small pipe, or a crude iron bell attached to a stake, its tongues swaying with the breeze. Some had small wooden covers with ventilation holes. Others had waxed canvas tubes stretching up like strange periscopes. They were escape holes, or more specifically, survival mechanisms, quiet nods to the terrifying idea that a person buried might not be quite dead. It was not superstition alone that fed this fear. It was experience. Throughout medieval England, reports circulated of bodies showing signs of life long after burial, fingernails clawing at coffin lids, bloodstains from broken lips, or shrouds that had been bitten through in desperation. Of course, many of these were exaggerated. Many more were misunderstood signs of decomposition, but not all. In an age when medicine had more to do with humors than with heartbeats, and when the pulse was an unreliable thing beneath shaking fingers, death was often declared based on breath alone. If none could be felt on a mirror or blade, the person was dead. Or so it was assumed, and so began a quiet cultural fear that would creep into the very ground of burial customs. The fear of premature burial in 1349. In the wake of the second major wave of plague in England, a monk named Father Elfric of Shrewsbury quoted a peculiar request from a dying noblewoman. She had lost her family to the plague. She was fevered, weak, convinced she, too, would perish. But she didn't ask for last rites. She didn't ask for gold to be left to the church. She asked for a pipe, a hollow reed, inserted into her mouth after her body was prepared for burial. If she awoke underground, she said she wanted a way to scream. Father Elfric was puzzled, but he fulfilled the request. 3 weeks later, after the fever had broken and she seemed miraculously recovered, she recounted that the idea had come from her nurse, who had once seen a man dug up in Dover with his hands twisted against his own jaw, his fingers shattered from the biting. She said he'd been buried too soon. Word spread. Soon in Shrewsbury, more requests like this emerged among nobles at first, but then among the wealthy tradesmen, and finally, even the clergy. If one had the means, one would pay for a burial with an escape pipe, a thin tube, usually metal. Later, with running from the coffin lid up to the surface. At first, these were used simply as markers. They let the gravediggers know exactly where the body was laid. But with time, small bells were attached to the ends. A string would be tied loosely around the corpse's hand or wrist, and if, in the darkest, most dreadful possibility, the dead man moved, the bell would ring. It sounds absurd today, but in the 14th century, in towns where priests barely had time to bless the dying before burying them in haste, this was not paranoia, it was insurance. One such bell, excavated in modern times from a churchyard in Lincolnshire, still bore an inscription, "Call and ye shall be heard. There is no record of that bell ever ringing, but others did. The Chronicles of St. Michael's Church in York recorded 2 such incidents between 1352 and 1357, both involving grave bells that sounded within 2 nights of burial. In one case, the grave was opened. The man inside was dead, but the string on his wrist was broken. In the other case, a young woman, she was found alive. Barely, she never spoke again. We do not know if this tale is exaggerated, but what matters isn't only the truth of the bell, it's the fact that, for decades after, these escape devices became part of burial expectations in certain parts of England. Not everywhere, not in the countryside, where coffins were rare and bodies were wrapped in shrouds, but in towns with money, where burials had become rituals of class as much as faith. There were even known professions attached to it. Some churches assigned death watchers hired caretakers to sit in the graveyard for the first 3 nights after burial. They were paid little, given ale and bread, and told to keep their ears open for any ringing. And yes, it was dull work. Many slept on the job. Others claimed to hear bells that weren't there, perhaps from wind or wishful ears. Some tried to rig the bells themselves to produce false calls for coin or fame. But despite the boredom, practice continued well into the late 15th century. What's most fascinating is how normalized this fear became in legal wills from the 1380s, especially in London and Canterbury. Phrases like "to be buried with," "pipe and bell" became routine. It was not seen as eccentric. It was seen as careful. Still, not everyone believed. Some physicians mocked the idea of escape holes. Others claimed it stirred unnecessary fear among the already death-weary population. A few accused priests of exploiting the fear, offering premium-priced escape tubes to families desperate to ensure their loved ones didn't wake to darkness and silence. But by then, devices had already entered the cultural psyche. They were even included in artwork, often subtly, as in a no-loss mural at St. Dunstan's in Kent that showed a grave with a small bell post beside it. In time, the literalness faded, but the theme endured. In legends, in poems, in stories of the not dead, the bell ringer beneath the soil became not just a fear, but a metaphor, a symbol of what we dread most, being silenced before our time. And though no records tell us how many actually escaped, the quiet panic still lingers in the soft clang of rusted metal found beside old bones. Question remains, how many were buried too soon and never had a bell? The tale of the bell ringer's watch doesn't end with the simple presence of a string and a bell tied to the cold finger of a corpse. As you may have suspected, the medieval mind did not rest easy on such innovations. These were not societies that made changes lightly. They were not comforted by complexity. Every advancement had to wrestle with fear, with custom, and often with superstition. Let's go back, for a moment, to the early 17th century. In certain pockets of Central Europe, a strange new ritual began emerging in the local graveyards. When a person was buried, particularly in places like Bavaria or Bohemia, the gravedigger would leave behind a simple but curious contraption. A wooden stake planted near the headstone, a string snaking down into the freshly packed earth, and a small bell left on top. The bell wasn't rung by the wind. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't there to signal the passing of time. It was there to be rung from beneath. What does it say about a people that they feared not just dying, but the idea of dying wrong? The idea that you might be lowered into the earth, not at the end of your life, but in the middle of it. That you might not be dead when they said you were. That the dirt tossed onto your coffin lid might be the beginning of a second, more horrifying chapter. The roots of this fear go back further than you might think, long before safety coffins or grave bells. Ancient texts already whispered about premature burial. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, ever curious about the natural and unnatural alike, noted instances of people waking from death-like trances. Galen, the physician, described a woman who awoke during her own funeral procession. But these were rare, isolated stories. In the ancient world, people died at home, and their deaths were slow and witnessed. By the medieval period, however, everything changed. Europe was not just a continent of superstition. It was a continent of plagues, fevers, and outbreaks. People died suddenly, in droves. At times, there were not enough physicians to go around, certainly. Not enough who were qualified. And the ones that did exist had little understanding of comas, catalepsy, or neurological shutdown. If you collapsed, pale and cold, and failed to respond to stimuli, you were most likely declared dead. But most likely is not good enough when the cost of being wrong is to wake up buried alive in the 14th and 15th centuries. A new term began to appear in court records and local medical accounts. Mortis simulata, simulated death. T was a Latin phrase that bridged the gap between what physicians suspected and what terrified families feared. The idea that someone might appear dead but still be clinging, barely, to life. This idea slowly seeped into the public imagination by the early 1600s. As the scientific revolution began to awaken the European mind, questions of anatomy and mortality became more than theological ponderings. They became scientific ones. In one case, in particular, sparked widespread alarm in 1626. In the city of Leipzig, a woman named Katharina Holtzmann was buried on a cold April afternoon. She had suffered from a sudden fainting spell, what the local barber surgeon described as an apoplexy. After several hours without movement, her breath undetectable, she was declared dead. She was buried the next day. 2 days later, her grave was found disturbed. The sexton, having passed by that part of the cemetery, noticed that the earth over her plot had shifted, slightly mounded, cracked, even as if something from beneath had pushed upward. They exhumed the coffin. The lid was still nailed shut, but faint scratches were visible near the edges. When they opened it, they discovered Katharina's face contorted in fear, her fingernails torn, and blood in her mouth. She had bitten through her tongue. She had, it seemed, woken in the dark, suffocated in her own grave. This story, and others like it, spread quickly. It's hard to know how much was fact and how much was the embellishment of fear. But what matters most in history is not always the truth. It is the belief that it could happen, the belief that perhaps it already had. And belief has consequences. As accounts of premature burials trickled through Germany, France, and parts of Britain, the idea of preventing such horrors began to take shape in public policy, religious custom, and graveyard architecture. The safety, Kofina, more mechanical version of the bell string, was not yet a mainstream invention, but the string and bell system was simple, cheap, and effective. And so, in many rural cemeteries, especially in areas of Saxony, Thuringia, and parts of Switzerland, a new method was adopted. The practice was straightforward. A string was tied to the hand or wrist of the deceased before burial. This string passed up through the coffin lid where a small hole had been drilled and extended to the surface. At the surface, the string was affixed to a stake or post beside the grave, where a small bell was mounted. If the person below moved their hand, the string would pull up and the bell would ring. But of course, this setup wasn't perfect. For one, the bodies moved, not often, but enough. The process of decomposition can cause subtle muscular contractions or shifts. Gases in the abdomen may distend, limbs may fall to one side. In one famous case, in the village of Meiringen, a gravedigger reported a bell ringing 3 days after a burial. The body was exhumed. Exhumed, no signs of life, just rot and swelling. It was a false alarm, but false alarms were dangerous too. The bell rang and the grave was dug up in time to find someone very much dead. What then? Was it still worth the effort? And if it rang and no one came in time, was that worse? These weren't hypothetical worries. Many graveyards, particularly those with watchmen or sextons on duty, bell-ringing graves were monitored for a week after burial. The job of the grave watchman was tedious. He would walk the rows at night, listening for the soft clang of a bell in the windless dark. Most nights, there was nothing. Just the creak of trees, the flutter of wings, and maybe, just maybe, a single, ringing sound that demanded an answer. What kind of man accepted that duty? Some were young apprentices of the church. Others were caretakers, former soldiers, or widowers with no other profession. They carried lanterns, a small spade, and sometimes a key for unlocking the wooden coffin vaults. Their role was both mundane and terrifying, for they were guardians of the space between death and life, not priests, not doctors, but something in between. In one surviving account from 1674, a grave watcher named Elias Weber from Antlingen recounted hearing a bell ring shortly after midnight. He found the grave and waited. No more sound came. He returned again at dawn. Nothing. And then, as he turned to leave, the bell rang again once. Faintly, he began to dig. The man he uncovered, Johann Richter, had been buried 2 days earlier. When Elias opened the coffin, he found Richter's eyes wide open. His lips were blue, his chest unmoving. But as Elias leaned closer, the man whispered a sound, barely audible. He was alive. Johann was carried back to his home, and, with time, he recovered. He never spoke publicly about the experience, but the record survives in Elias's own handwriting. A note kept in the church ledger exhumed the man at dawn. His eyes opened. He breathed. I prayed. Thanks. How many more were not found in time? We don't know. And perhaps that is why the fear remained so powerful. It wasn't just about those who were rescued. It was about those who weren't. The silence of a still grave. The possibility that someone had rung their bell until their last breath. And no one came. By the 18th century, with the rise of Enlightenment thinking, many physicians began developing more rigorous tests for death. The mirror test, in which a small mirror was held near the nose to detect breath. The tongue pull test, where pain was administered to elicit response. Some doctors even recommended slicing a tendon or artery post-mortem, just to be sure. But in villages far from the centers of science, the bell strings remained. They were affordable. They were understandable. Hey, and in their simplicity, they offered comfort, not only for the dead, but for the living. To bury your child, your wife, your father in, know that if some mistake had been made, there was still hope. That if they stirred, they could call out, that they would not die alone in the earth, unheard. And yet, the question lingers. How many times did those bells ring and no one listened? By the close of the 1700s, the bell ringer's watch had become more than a precaution. It had become folklore. Children whispered about it on the way home from school, glancing nervously at the oldest rows of the cemetery, where moss covered every name and no bell post remained. In the darkest corners of village memory, stories were passed down not only about the people who had been buried alive and saved, but about those who hadn't, about bells that rang too late, about watchmen who were drunk, about strings that broke. If you were to walk through the quiet churchyards of rural Germany or France in those years, you might find yourself tripping over the remnants of those old posts, a stake rotted through, a notch in the headstone where the bell had been attached, a small round hole at the head of a coffin vault, long since filled in. All that effort, all that hope, and yet in most places, no one even remembered who had once been tied to the string. Why did it end? Why did this once soothing safeguard of the dead vanish from our cemeteries? The answer, like most things in history, is layered when first came the shift in medical authority. As modern science grew in confidence during the 18th century, the line between life and death was scrutinized more closely. Physicians were no longer content to declare someone dead just by touch or color. New instruments like stethoscopes, thermometers, and, later, ophthalmoscopes helped confirm the absence of life with more certainty. Then came urbanization. Graveyards, once local and familiar, grew crowded. Cities like London, Paris, and Vienna began suffering under the weight of their dead. The rural grave bell system didn't scale. There simply wasn't space or staff to accommodate it. In some places, graves were stacked. Bells would tangle, strings would snap. Besides, a notion of leaving open holes to the surface so that a string might escape her, afoul of public hygiene and sanitation. More than that, was a growing embarrassment. As Enlightenment values swept across Europe, so too did a disdain for the superstitions of the peasantry. Grave bells, safety coffins, even the fear of being buried alive, these were increasingly seen as medieval fears, unfounded and unworthy of the rational age. To mention them was to seem old-fashioned, ignorant, backward. Yet for all this, the fear did not truly die. In fact, it adapted in the 19th century. The idea of being buried alive experienced a strange revival not in graveyards, but in the pages of books, the folds of newspapers, and the imaginations of terrified readers. In 1828, the French medical journal La Lancet estimated that out of 1,000 deaths, at least 2 were premature burials. This ignited public panic. Newspapers began reprinting older stories like that of Katharina Holtzman and adding new ones. In 1831, the case of Margaret Schilling in Ohio, USA, made headlines. Her body had been discovered weeks after her supposed death, entombed in a locked asylum room. Though not a burial, the fear of isolation while alive stoked the same old fire. Literature followed suit. The American writer Edgar Allan Poe, famously obsessed with the fear of premature burial, capitalized on the public's anxiety. 1844 story, The Premature Burial, describes in detail a man's descent into paranoia over being entombed while still breathing. He recounts historical cases, some based on real reports, and builds a slow, creeping terror that resonated with Victorian readers. These stories weren't dismissed. They were devoured. People believed, and that belief gave birth to a new wave of inventions, the so-called safety coffin. These were patented in Germany, France, the UK, and the United States throughout the 1800s. They included air tubes, flags, bells, and even periscopes. Some had feeding tubes or escape hatches. One enterprising German inventor included a spring-loaded lid that could be triggered from inside. It was as if technology had taken the humble graveyard bell and turned it to an industry. One of the most famous of these was the 1894 invention by Dr. Franz Pfister, who created a burial vault with a ladder, breathing tube, and bell system, all of which could be operated from inside. The idea was that if you awoke in darkness, you wouldn't panic. You'd simply climb out, ring the bell, and wait for rescue. But these coffins were expensive and complicated, and in the end, mostly unused by the early 20th century. With modern embalming, refrigeration, and hospital certification of death, the chance of premature burial dropped drastically. The bell ringer's watch, once manned by lantern-bearing graveyard caretakers, was reduced to a quirky tale. Something your grandmother might mention, and you might dismiss with a nervous laugh. And yet, the fear remains. Ask anyone, even today, what their worst nightmare is. Somewhere on that list, alongside drowning or being trapped in a burning building, you'll still find it. The fear of waking up in a coffin, of shouting with no air, of ringing a bell that no one hears. Even now, some cultures preserve echoes of the old grave bell tradition in parts of southern Italy. Small holes are still left in crypt doors, both for airflow and for the voice of the soul to escape. In Haiti, in Vodou tradition, there are practices to ensure the spirit is truly free before burial. In Mongolia, sky burials prevent premature interment altogether. And in Japan, the custom of family vigil, watching the dead body for hours or days before burial, serves not only to mourn, but to make sure it's easy to think we've outgrown such fears, that we're modern now, scientific, rationale. But consider this: in 1995, a man in South Africa named Sifo William Malech was mistakenly declared dead after a car crash. He was placed in a mortuary drawer. 21 hours later, he was found, alive, pounding on the metal from the inside. He made a full recovery, and in 2014, an elderly Polish woman named Janina Kolkowicz woke up in a body bag in a mortuary refrigerator, 11 hours after being declared dead by a doctor. She asked for a warm cup of tea. So maybe the bells aren't quite silent yet. Maybe the graveyards still listen. Maybe somewhere, in a forgotten corner of an old cemetery, there's still a string tied to a buried wrist, just in case. And maybe the most haunting part isn't that people were once afraid of being buried alive. It's that they had reason to be. In the early morning light, long before the crows began their ragged caws, a line of villagers gathered at the edge of the moor. The sky was low and gray, and the air held that damp cold particular to northern England. At the front of the group, wrapped in wool and sorrow, stood 4 men with rough-hewn staffs and cords slung over their shoulders. Between them, a long wooden box plane, unadorned, hung like a cradle. The body inside was stiff now, hands folded over the chest, a token, cross clutched tight. The man had died 2 days ago, but the journey to his final resting place could not begin until now. They were about to set off on the corpse road. It was called by many names, depending on the county: corpse path, coffin road, beer way, lich way, but its purpose was singular. In a time when only consecrated ground could receive a Christian burial, and not every village had a churchyard, there had to be a way to carry the dead from remote hamlets to central parish graveyards. And so, across the windswept hills of Cumbria, the craggy passes of Yorkshire, and the sodden forests of Devon, these narrow, winding footpaths were carved by feet, by death, by time. Some of these corpse roads stretched for 10 or 12 miles, often through wild, unforgiving terrain. And for centuries, it was said that no living soul should walk them, at least not willingly, for the road belonged to the dead. You can still find remnants of them today. A mossy stretch in Dartmoor, sunken lane flanked by hawthorn in the Lake District. And in Yorkshire, a faint track called the Way of the Dead, only visible when the bracken thins in winter. The land forgets quickly, but stone remembers. And these paths haunted by history still echo with the footsteps of centuries of funerals. To understand why these roads existed, we must understand the logistics and the beliefs of medieval death. In medieval England, death was not merely a matter of final breath. It was a spiritual transition that had to be carefully managed. The soul needed proper rites, and the body required holy burial. A parish churchyard was consecrated ground, meaning it had been ritually blessed by a bishop or priest. Any burial outside it was not just undesirable, it was dangerous. Person buried in unconsecrated soil was thought to risk damnation. Worse still, the community risked the return of the spirit. A restless dead could haunt a village, spreading disease, madness, or misfortune. To prevent this, the body had to reach the church. And if your village lacked a churchyard, as many did before the Reformation, you had no choice but to walk the body across the land to one that did. This was not a simple matter. The roads were rarely direct. You could not cut through someone's field. Landowners resisted corpses crossing their property. believing it cursed the soil. Superstition held that once a corpse passed through a place, the spirit might linger. Even worse, it could draw others after it, inviting death into the household. So corpse roads followed the ridge lines and commons, the old rights-of-way and bridle paths no one could claim. They avoided homes, they sidestepped towns, crept alongside ancient boundary stones, and skirted ruins long since swallowed by ivy. And always they led to the church. The dead had a path, and the living kept off it. There were strict customs. The body was usually carried in a bier, wooden frame, or box on the shoulders of pallbearers. These men often wore specific garments, sometimes even taking a vow of silence during the procession. Every few miles, there would be a resting place known as a coffin stone or lich stone. Here, the bier could be lowered, and the men could stretch and pray. These stones still exist. You'll find them shaped like rough tables or benches, flattened by time. Some are carved with grooves where the water pools, others with hollowed centers where the pallbearers once placed their burdens. Some are even inscribed with Latin or Old English, though the words have mostly worn away. Superstition held that the spirit of the dead paused here too, catching its breath for the journey ahead. But these pauses were brief. Time mattered, you see. It was not enough to simply reach the church. The dead had to arrive quickly. If decomposition began before burial, the odor was not just offensive, it was considered a breach of spiritual decorum, a sign the soul was not at peace. Even worse, it might prevent the body from being interred at all. Priests could refuse to perform the rites if the corpse was in too poor condition, so families hurried the process. And on the corpse roads, they did not linger. But there was another reason for speed, a reason no one liked to talk about. Burial meant finality. It meant no chance of return, and sometimes, only sometimes, people feared the dead weren't fully dead. The same medieval fear that birthed grave bells and escape holes bled into these corpse roads. If the journey took too long, the body twitched if a noise came from the bier. Some processions were said to abandon the body midway, to leave it at a coffin stone and run. There's a folk story from Shropshire about a man named Roger Wilkes, who died suddenly during the harvest. His family, fearing the walk to the parish church would be too long, began the procession at dusk. Somewhere past the third resting stone, the men heard tapping from inside the box. They froze. Then the lid lifted just slightly. No one spoke. They dropped the bier and fled. The next morning, they returned with the priest. The lid was shut. The man was dead. But who closed it? Such stories were not common, but they were remembered. Over time, the church formalized the process. Each parish tried to secure its own burial ground. The need for long corpse roads diminished, but the fear remained. What's curious is that these roads weren't always abandoned. In fact, in some parts of England, even after new churchyards were built, people continued to use the old corpse paths out of habit or fear. Some claimed it was safer to follow the road of the dead, that the spirit of the deceased knew the way, and that to take another route might confuse or trap it. There's a belief, dating back to pre-Christian times, that spirits follow straight lines, that they cannot turn corners or cross running water. Many corpse roads were designed with this in mind, deliberately avoiding rivers, following clear ridges, and often running as straight as possible across the landscape. If you deviated from the path, you might never escape what followed. This belief was so strong that certain villages built corpse bridges or causeways specifically for the dead to cross terrain that would otherwise be impossible. In places like Dovedale and Landwist, narrow stone footbridges remain, unused except by walkers retracing the paths of the past. Even in modern times, these paths appear on ordnance survey maps, marked not as roads or trails, but sometimes as churchway or old way. Ask a local, and you might hear a tale. They'll point to a stretch of mossy land between two fences and say, "That's the way they took the bodies." Then they'll go quiet, because in some places, they still do. And so the question remains, what happens to a path built only for the dead? Does it fade like footsteps in the grass, or does it wait? In the folds of the countryside, where bracken thickens and winds moan low, are there still spirits who remember? The idea that the dead needed their own roads may sound strange to modern ears, but to the people of medieval England, it was as ordinary and necessary as a church bell or a thatched roof. Death was not a singular moment. It was a journey. And like any journey in a world without maps or certainty, it needed direction, rules, and space of its own. The corpse roads, those narrow paths worn into turf and soil by centuries of funerals, were the physical maps of the dead. Their geography was not always logical to the living. A route that doubled back, one that crossed a steep hill or curved around a long-forgotten stone circle, might seem inefficient to a modern mind, but efficiency was not the point, okay? The routes were drawn, not by engineers, but by priests, by myth, by necessitand, by fear. And fear shaped many things in the region of Dartmoor, where fog coils through the valleys like breath from the mouths of the long-buried stories persisted of corpse candles, small floating lights seen dancing along the old ways. These lights, called Canwyll Corph in Welsh, were said to appear before a death in the village, moving solemnly along the corpse road the deceased would soon follow. Sometimes they were white and flickering, like tallow, sometimes blue, cold, and near the ground. In nearly every account, the lights were silent, purposeful, and unchallenged by wind. People avoided crossing their path. To witness the light was to know a death was coming. Some saw them as portent sacred omens that gave villagers time to prepare. Others believed they were souls, walking in advance of their own bodies, trapped in repetition. One priest wrote, in the 14th century, that the lights which walk the bier paths at night are not candle nor flame, but those who sleep unshriven, searching still for holy ground. These beliefs mattered. They shaped where paths were allowed. A road that cut too near a well, especially a holy well, was seen as dangerous. Water was liminal in medieval cosmology, a boundary between life and death, purity and corruption. To let a corpse pass to near a sacred spring might pollute it. And so some corpse roads made long detours, not around physical obstacles, but spiritual ones. In Yorkshire, the path from a cluster of moorland hamlets to the main parish of Arncliffe took a jagged turn near an ancient yew tree. The tree itself was older than Christianity in Britain, perhaps older than recorded time in that region, and it stood near a spring locals considered blessed. Rather than offend the tree's spirit or the water beneath it, the procession route diverted up a slope and added nearly a mile to the journey. No one questioned the logic. They simply walked. There's a peculiar humility to that. It's an entire worldview where the boundaries between the sacred and the mundane weren't just mental, but geographical. You couldn't just decide to carry a coffin any way you pleased. You followed the road that had been followed for generations. To stray from it was to stray from tradition and, perhaps, to invite a spirit's displeasure in some cases. The roads were so tied to their purpose that laws protected them. In parts of medieval Wales and Scotland, landowners were forbidden to enclose or farm across corpse roads. They were treated as rights of way for the dead fixed in the social and spiritual fabric of the region. The stone markers were sometimes placed along the path to ensure no confusion, especially during harsh weather when visibility was poor. One such marker still stands near Grasmere in the Lake District, known locally as the Dead Man's Stone, a lichen-covered boulder sunk deep into the grass. It bears no inscription, but villagers say it was where coffins paused on the last turn toward St. Oswald's Church. For centuries, it was tradition to whisper a prayer at the stone before continuing, not for the soul of the dead, but for the living so they would not carry sorrow home with them. That idea, that mourning itself, was dangerous runs deep in these traditions. In many communities, those who carried the bier were not allowed to enter the family's home afterward. To cross the threshold with death still on the shoulders, so to speak, was to contaminate the space. They would often wash their hands and faces at a communal basin outside the village, sometimes even changing clothes. It was a ritual of purification, not unlike those in much older, even pre-Christian cultures. The church did not always approve of such customs, especially as the Reformation swept across England. Many corpse roads fell out of use in the 16th and 17th centuries as parishes multiplied and local churchyards were consecrated more widely. But some of the roads lingered even after their original purpose was gone. People still felt something, a presence, a weight in the Oxfordshire village of Lifford. Locals speak in hushed tones about a particular stretch of path between the mill and the now ruined chapel. It no longer leads anywhere, just a trail across 2 fields and into a stand of trees. But older villagers claim it was once part of a corpse road. Children were told not to play on it after dark. A game of chase might turn strange. A child might run ahead and not be seen again until dusk, standing perfectly still at the old chapel stone, eyes wide. It could be nothing. Stories have a way of growing from shadows, but enough of them, over enough centuries, began to point to something else, a collective unease. Perhaps it's not fear of death, but of what death leaves behind. Traces, paths, habits, the belief that a spirit, having once walked a road, might walk it again. Medieval people believed in restless souls, and not just the malevolent kind. There were eldritch hauntings, yes, spirits that brought harm or sickness, but there were also lost ones, confused ones, even protective ones. Some corpse roads, particularly those in border regions or near battlefields, were said to host the spirits of the wrongly buried. Men who died without absolution, or women buried outside holy ground for bearing children out of wedlock. These were not angry ghosts, just misplaced, and the road straight, narrow, ancient was the only place they still knew how to follow. That's why certain customs emerged. At junctions or crossroads, villagers would lay a small stone or bundle of herbs, marjoram, yarrow, or mugwort, not to ward off evil, but to offer guidance, an invitation for the soul to continue on its way. In a few remote places, especially in Northumberland and Cumbria, these were replaced with tiny wooden crosses staked into the turf. They've long since rotted, but the practice was documented by early antiquaries. It's tempting to see all this as superstition, but it was also a form of landscape literacy. People knew their land not by ownership, but by usage. A copse of trees might be where lovers met, a spring where the sick were healed, and a narrow path of flattened grass where the dead walked. These meanings gave the land shape not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual memory of a place. Corpse roads weren't just about transporting bodies. They were about transporting meaning. A person that died, a community gathered, walked together, shouldered the weight, and handed the dead into the care of consecrated soil. That act, repeated over generations, carved something invisible into the landscape. And even now, in the right light, with the wind low and the sheep quiet, some swear they can feel it, the imprint of passage. The dead leave no footprints, but perhaps they leave grooves in the earth or in the mind. And if these paths were truly roads of memory, what happens when they vanish? What if a supermarket is built over a corpse road? What happens to the souls? There is something unsettling about standing on a patch of land where countless others once walked, carrying grief between their shoulders and realizing no trace remains. The corpse roads of medieval England are disappearing, fading from memory, buried beneath asphalt, farmland, and housing estates. But in the medieval world, these paths were seen as eternal threads in the fabric of a village's soul. So, what happens when you cut one? In medieval cosmology, roads for the dead could not simply be diverted. Their roots were born of necessity, yes, but they were sanctified by use. Every body carried, every prayer whispered, every stone placed or bootstep taken pressed the line deeper into the land. The corpse road was, in a sense, a rite unto itself, form of liturgy in motion, even when the roads became obsolete. When new churches were built closer to outlying hamlets, or when the church officially discouraged superstitious burial customs, villagers continued to honor the roots. In some remote parishes, locals insisted that funeral processions retrace the traditional corpse path, even when roads allowed easier access. The older generation would say, that's the way we came into the world, and that's the way we'll go out. But over the centuries, as enclosure acts and estate expansions swept through rural England, many of these footpaths were absorbed into private lands. Hedges were planted across them. Stone walls interrupted the route. In some cases, wealthy landowners deliberately blocked corpse roads, viewing them as relics of pagan superstition, as simply nuisances that interfered with neat fields and fencing. And so they vanished, or rather, they went underground. Folklore rarely dies. It just shifts in Cumbria. There are stories of hedges that wither mysteriously along narrow strips where no grass will grow. In East Sussex, a modern garden development was plagued by odd happenings: tools disappearing, flower beds failing, birds refusing to land. A local historian traced the site back and realized it intersected a medieval bier path, once used to carry bodies to the now ruined St. Martin's Chapel. No one could say for certain what that meant, but the unease lingered. Even today, some locals refer to the term corpse road with caution. It's not uncommon, especially in the north, to hear phrases like the straight way or the old track rather than name the route outright. The belief that such roads are still active in some ethereal sense has persisted into the present. One theory suggests this folk belief is rooted in psychology. When a community enacts a ritual over centuries, it imprints memory not just into minds, but into muscle, habit, and space. The path becomes more than a road, it becomes the shape of mourning itself. A procession walks slowly, with measured steps, pausing at resting stones. These patterns became encoded in cultural memory. Even those who don't consciously know the route may still feel drawn to it. In some villages, people walk their dogs along stretches of forgotten corpse roads, noting how the animals behave differently, slower, more hesitant. Others avoid them entirely without knowing why. And then there are those who preserve them quietly. Local history groups, landscape archaeologists, and curious walkers have spent decades attempting to map the lost corpse roads of Britain. Some use old tide maps or parish burial records. Others walk the countryside with nothing but folklore and compass in hand. It's a kind of spiritual archaeology, recovering not objects, but movements, roots, echoes. One such group in Devon made a remarkable discovery in 2009, using both historical maps and local oral tradition. They traced a lost corpse road from the hamlet of Throla to the Church of St. Mary in South Seal. Along the way, they uncovered a series of stone slabs. Buried under turf-like coffin, rests ranged at regular intervals just off the modern path. One stone bore a shallow groove, worn by centuries of rainwater and hands. When the find was announced, several elderly locals came forward with stories ones they hadn't shared in years. One woman recalled her grandmother telling her never to walk that path barefoot. Another remembered being told to hold your breath at the corner near the fallen oak. though she no longer remembered why. These were not superstitions in their time. They were instructions, rituals. Today, the route is marked again. A small wooden post, painted by hand, reads, "The Way of the Dead." Most passers-by don't notice, but those who do walk it often report a strange sense of stillness, not dread, not fear, just silence. And that silence tells its own story. It reminds us that the dead once had designated space. In medieval England, they were not hidden away or quickly disposed of. Were walked, sung over, handled, carried, and seen. The path mattered, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. The last shared journey between the living and the dead. This raises uncomfortable questions for the modern age. What happens when death becomes invisible? When the journey is reduced to paperwork, clinical silence, or distant crematoriums? What does it mean to live in a culture that no longer walks with its dead? Some argue that we have lost something, not just in ritual, but in understanding. The medieval corpse road was not efficient. It wasn't about minimizing time or expense. It was about enacting grief, sharing it, embodying it. Neighbors came together to carry the coffin. The procession passed through spaces. The deceased had known fields they worked, woods they wandered, stone crosses they once prayed beside. Death was a passage, not just a moment. And everyone, by walking, participated in that passage. Today, most people die behind curtains. Their transport is unseen. The burial is often small, private, spilled off. There is no path. There is no beer stone, no resting pause beneath the yew. Instead, there is movement without ritual hurry, without weight. And in that absence, something unspoken lingers, quiet. Wondering if we no longer walk with our dead, are we still in conversation with them? Or have we, like so many old tracks, been fenced off from the past? The dead, in the medieval imagination, did not ask for much. A straight path, a place to rest, a final passage carried with care. And in return, they would sleep quietly at last. But if the path disappears, does their silence go with it? In the cool hush of an English twilight, the gentle breeze would sometimes carry the sound of a bell, a faint ringing from beneath the ground. To some, it was the wind, a trick of the imagination, or the echo of a distant church steeple. To those who remembered, who lived close to the old churchyards, it was something else. It was a safety bell, a tether to life rung by a hand that should have stilled long ago. You've likely heard the phrase, "saved by the bell," tossed off casually in conversation or competition. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, it could carry a far more literal meaning. In a world where medicine wavered between guesswork and prayer, and where the stillness of the body didn't always mean death, the fear of being buried alive haunted the living. And so they invented the safety coffin. To understand why these strange contraptions were installed across parts of Europe and, particularly in England, you must return to a time before reliable diagnostics. In medieval and early modern eras, diagnosing death was as much a spiritual inquiry as a medical one. Priests were often consulted. Physicians hesitated. Families watched for signs: clouded eyes, slack jaws, shallow breath. But sometimes the signs lied. It happened more often than you might think. Catalepsy, comas, hypothermia, the slowed heart of someone with cholera, the shallow breaths of a person in shock, and without the tools to measure oxygen or brain activity. The line between death and suspended life was thinner, blurry even. Burials were often done quickly. Disease and decomposition moved fast in the summer months. Refrigeration didn't exist. In some towns, it was customary to bury the deceased within 24 hours. Families were eager to grieve, to move on, to settle property and say their farewells. But in those early hours, with candles still flickering around the body, the chance of error was real. And so, stories began to circulate, whispers of groans heard from graves, of coffins exhumed with claw marks on the inside. Whether these were urban legends or actual cases, they lit a spark in the public imagination. People feared not death itself, but the possibility of conscious burial. This fear reached a fever pitch in the 1700s and 1800s, leading to widespread anxiety about premature interment. Entire books were published cataloging cases. In 1742, a German man named Christian Franz Paulini published a treatise on people mistakenly buried alive, sparking interest, terror across Europe. In England, such fears took on a particular flavor. Graveyards were growing, parishes had limited space, medical understanding remained rudimentary. The poor were buried in common pits. The rich had their family tombs, but no greater assurance of accuracy. Thus emerged a curious invention, the safety coffin. Some were quite simple strings tied to the fingers of the deceased, which led through a hole in the coffin to a bell mounted on the surface above. If the person moved or twitched in a revival, the bell would ring. A night watchman, sometimes hired by the family, would sit nearby, usually under a lean-to, sometimes sipping from a flask, and listen for the sound of a bell in the dark. Other designs were more elaborate. A few featured air tubes for ventilation, allowing the occupant to breathe until help arrived. Some included viewing panels or speaking tubes. The most ambitious models had flags that would rise, triggered by movement within the coffin. In 1791, a man named Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick requested in his will that his body be placed in a specially designed coffin with a glass window, a tube to the surface, and a key laced in his hand, so that should he awake, he could unlock his tomb from within. In 1792, in England, a man named William Tebb began documenting premature burials. He compiled hundreds of alleged cases. One woman was said to have revived during her funeral, sat upright in the coffin, and lived another 10 years. Another was exhumed only to find the body turned over, nails broken, mouth agape in terror. True or not, these tales gripped the imagination, and they led to innovation. By the early 1800s, a new profession emerged in quiet corners of England, the mortuary safety engineer. These were not officially recognized roles, but inventive minds who specialized in designing post-mortem fail-safes for the wealthy. Diagrams of bell mechanisms were circulated in pamphlets. Blacksmiths were commissioned to build the iron frames. Some coffins were made with hinged lids and spring bolts that could be pushed open from inside. Families would pay extra to ensure peace of mind. Even churches adapted. In a few churchyards, especially those with medical schools nearby, small shelters were built next to burial sites for grave watchers. Some included rudimentary stoves or chairs. It became common in certain parishes to hold the body above ground for a number of days before burial. This was called a waiting mortuary, essentially a delay, just in case the departed decided to undepart. But not everyone could afford a custom safety coffin. Among the poor, death remained quick and anonymous. For them, the anxiety festered in silence. Some whispered prayers too. Saint Christina the Astonishing, a patron of those who'd been presumed dead. Others placed mirrors before their deceased loved one's mouth to check for breath, pricked fingers with needles to test for pain response. Still, it was no guarantee, and so the bells rang in at least 5 documented English cemeteries between 1790 and 1820. Grave watchers swore under oath that they had heard the sound, not once, but multiple times. A bell tinkling in the midnight wind. Faint, irregular, but undeniable. They would rush to the grave, sometimes digging, sometimes only listening. Most of the time, they found nothing. But once, in Durham, they did. A woman named Margaret Alfield, aged 26, had died suddenly after a fever. She was buried in haste, owing to the warm weather. 3 nights later, the watchman heard the bell on her grave ring 3 times. He hesitated, unsure whether he'd imagined it. But the next night, it rang again once, then silence, then once more. When the grave was exhumed, Margaret was indeed alive. Faint, dehydrated, and bruised, but alive. She lived another 7 years, and her story made headlines in the local gazette. Afterward, the cemetery saw a boom in safety coffin installations. Parents placed bells on children's graves. Wealthy widowers ordered elaborate mechanisms from London craftsmen. And for a while, the fear in the bell industry thrived. But it did not last forever as medical science improved. Especially after the 1850s, confidence in death diagnostics grew. The invention of the stethoscope, more standardized criteria, better training for physicians. Eventually, the practice of installing bells and escape tubes fell out of favor. They were seen as quaint, outdated, even comical. Some mocked them in popular literature. Others dismantled the mechanisms. In most places, they rusted away, forgotten, and yet, not entirely. In a village near Shropshire, one can still find the remains of a safety coffin on display, a simple wooden box with a rusted bell attached via cord. The grave it belonged to is marked by a worn stone. No inscription remains, it's just a name. Thomas' surname faded by time. People who visit say the grave is quiet, peaceful, but on foggy mornings, when the mist hugs the earth and the church bell rings in the distance, some swear they hear a faint metallic chime far too close, too low to be the bell tower. And they pause, just for a moment, and listen. It's probably nothing. Just the wind, or a memory that refuses to die. The man assigned to listen for the bells was not a priest, nor a doctor, nor even a proper night guard. His name was Elias Finn, and he had once been a shoemaker by trade, till his fingers curled with age and his eyes refused to thread the leather needle by candlelight. Now he sat beside the graves. His post was a lean wooden shelter, nestled among the eastern stones of St. Mercia's yard, a church graveyard no larger than an orchard. A simple plank chair, a narrow table with a lantern, a kettle of weak tea, a bell register. These were the tools of his nighttime vigil. Elias was not chosen for his strength or vigilance. He was chosen because he was cheap, had no family, and didn't ask questions. He didn't mind the long hours or the silence. In truth, he found it peaceful. The world outside the graveyard was noisy with trades and tempers. Here, time breathed more slowly. His job was simple. If a bell rang, even a tremor, even a single chime, he was to light the lantern, locate the grave, and call the verger. The verger would then summon help and begin the delicate task of opening the coffin, assuming the sound had not been a trick of the wind. Each evening, as the sun dipped low, Elias would walk the grounds before nightfall, checking each grave fitted with a bell. Thin cords rose from a carved hole in the coffin lid, fed through a brass or wooden pipe, and connected to a small handbell on a frame above ground. The bells were ordinary, the kind used for shop doors or horses, but in this place, it carried the weight of final chances. He would gently tug each cord to make sure it hadn't rotted or tangled. Some were already frayed, chewed by rats, or worn thin by dew. Those he trimmed and replaced. Others had been untouched for years, families that no longer visited, names whose descendants had long since moved away. There were 23 such graves in St. Mercia's yard, 23 souls whose families had paid for a bell system, hoping that, just in case, the one they loved might claw their way back from the shadowed place. Some had been buried decades ago, their bells rusted and seized. Others were fresh, the cords still taut, the brass still polished. Elias had memorized them all. He had names, ages, and rough causes of death written in his register, but he also knew their positions by instinct, okay? Like a shepherd knows his flock. He had never heard a bell ring. Not once, not truly. A few times in winter, ice had knocked a cord sideways. In spring, a sparrow had landed on one. Once, a child threw a stone at the bell and sent it clanging in the fog, only to run off laughing. But nothing from the grave itself. No twitch, no rattle dot still. Elias watched. There was one grave he watched more than most. It was on the northern edge, half covered in moss, with a tilted cross and a copper bell dulled to green. It belonged to Sarah Allerton, aged 19. Died of fevered wasting, the register said. She had been buried 3 months before Elias began the job. He hadn't known her in life, but he remembered the first time he saw her name. Her mother had stood beside the grave during the burial, gripping the cord tightly in her gloved hand, refusing to let go until the very last moment. She had moments where she breathed again. The mother had whispered to the vicar. She opened her eyes the night before, only for a second, but she opened them. The vicar had said nothing. Elias believed her. Each night, he would pause a little longer by Sarah's grave, just in case. Sometimes he would whisper to the grave. As he walked past, still sleeping, "Miss," he would ask, as though she were dozing in a quiet bedchamber rather than resting in the soil. One night, deep in December, the sky hung heavy with fog. The trees around the graveyard were bare, their limbs brittle and bone-white against the dusk. The moon refused to shine. A thin frost coated the grass, crunching beneath Elias's boots as he made his rounds. He paused at Sarah's grave. Then he heard it, not loud, not urgent, but a sound unmistakable in the deep silence of the yard. Soft, deliberate chime, once and then again. His breath caught in his throat. He turned to the bell. It was still, perfectly still. He leaned down, touched the cord, still taut. No vibration. He looked again. His heart beat so loudly he could feel it in his neck. He waited. Nothing. Was it the wind? The fog? His own imagination? He stood there for a long time. 5 minutes. 10. Finally, he forced himself to return to the shelter. He brewed tea, but the cup shook in his hands. He opened the register and stared at the names, reading them aloud in his head, letting the familiarity settle him. He didn't call the verger. Perhaps he should have, but doubt is a powerful weight, and Elias had grown old in the service of silence. The next morning, he visited the grave again. He checked the bell. It was untroubled. He scratched a note in the register beside her name. December 18th, possible chime, single tone. No confirmation. He never heard it again, but he stayed a little longer each night near her grave. Years passed. Graveyard. Fashions changed. People preferred to be buried in city cemeteries now, or in family plots with proper mausoleums. The bell systems were no longer requested. The parish stopped funding Elias's post. The shelter was taken down. The cords decayed, but Elias remained. He came each evening, unpaid, out of habit. He couldn't bring himself to leave the watch until one spring, when he too passed away quietly in his sleep. Cup of tea by his bedside at his request. He was buried in St. Mercia's yard, a simple pine coffin, unadorned, but one detail was added at his insistence: a bell, his own, the very one that had stood above Sarah's grave for so many years. Polished, clean, and retied with fresh cord, it was placed beside his headstone on a simple wooden post. No one expected it to ring. The bell was a kindness, a nod to his long years of vigil. But sometimes, in the gray mist of morning, it would jingle once, then fall silent. They said it was the wind, or a robin landing, or the sigh of the earth adjusting. But those who had known Elias would walk beside him in the quiet hours and seen the way he paused beside every grave, believed otherwise. They believed it was his way of checking in, of watching, just in case. It had been 3 decades since Elias Van had last patrolled the soft, mossy rows of St. Mercia's graveyard. 3 decades since the bell above his own grave had been affixed with care, and since the cords beneath the soil had been buried with quiet purpose, a final gesture from a man who had waited half his life for a sound that never came. Time had not been kind to the graveyard. St. Mercia's Parish Church still stood, but only barely, its roof slanted, its windows covered in soot from the nearby mill town. The land surrounding it had transformed. Once nestled in pastoral quiet, it was now pressed in by fences, factory walls, and the chimneys of a fast industrializing village that never slept. Yet the graveyard endured. The headstones leaned drunkenly. The trees had grown wild, roots threading under old crypts and tipping stones sideways. Ivy swallowed iron railings. Names, once etched deep into slate, were now softened by rain and time. By the late 19th century, most of the villagers had forgotten the purpose of the strange little bells, or thought they had been part of some quaint superstition. Children would dare one another to tug a cord or touch the posts, claiming the sound summoned ghosts. Some of the cords had rotted to threads. Others were removed entirely by caretakers who found them an annoyance, unaware that some of the graves still had intact mechanisms beneath. Then came a peculiar little man named Mr. Albie Perrault. He was a folklorist, though not in any official capacity, the sort who wrote long letters to small journals and submitted articles with titles like On the Bells of Burial, A Study in Fear. He was not a man of great reputation, nor was he particularly respected in the scholarly circles of London. But he had something else, a quiet persistence, and an unshakable fascination with the fear of premature burial. Albie had once read of the great 18th century panic, the spate of supposed cases where people were buried alive after fevers or fainting spells, only to wake in their coffins days later. He had clipped every newspaper story, saved every account of exhumed coffins with fingernail scratches on the lids, and even purchased a used safety coffin blueprint from a retired physician who had once tried to patent such a device. When he learned that a parish in a forgotten Midlands village had once fitted an entire row of graves with escape bells, he packed a carpet bag, boarded a soot-smudged train, and arrived in St. Mercia on a cold February morning. He found little welcome. The church was closed most days, its priest a man more concerned with bookkeeping than theology. The townsfolk did not remember Elias Fenn, nor Sarah Allerton, nor why so many bells had once stood in the yard. But the graveyard itself remained, and the grave of Elias was still there. Its bell post leaned now, half consumed by ivy. The bell itself was streaked with rust, but it was unmistakable, larger than the others, older, mounted with care. And the cord, miraculously, had been replaced sometime in the past few years. Albie took photographs. He traced Elias's name. With his finger, he sketched diagrams. But what drew his attention most was the pattern of graves. How many of them had small boreholes beneath the headstone, barely visible, but unmistakably drilled with intention. Some still had the remnants of cord inside. He wrote an article about St. Mercia, submitted it to a journal on burial customs. It was never published, but word traveled, not in academic circles, but in popular ones. A penny newspaper in Manchester ran a brief, illustrated story, The Bellkeepers of the Dead. Did the English once fear waking in their coffins? Accompanied by a fanciful sketch of a skeletal hand reaching for a bell. Soon, visitors came. Not many, but enough to unsettle the parish board. Some tried to dig, others chipped pieces from the bell posts to take as souvenirs. Eventually, the churchyard was locked at night, and the bells were removed. Some sold as scrap, others stored in a shed behind the church. Elias's bell disappeared one day. No one knew when it was simply gone, and with it, chapter closed. The cords decayed. The graves were still. Time continued its patient erosion of memory. Yet, there was one person who refused to forget. A school teacher named Clara Hewitt, who lived in the village and had read Albie Perrow's piece. Clara was not a historian by trade, nor a superstitious woman. But she had grown up walking past St. Mercia's yard, and had often paused beside the grave with the large bell, the one children whispered about on foggy mornings. Years later, her early retirement, she began a project. Quietly, without funding or support, she began collecting names from the old registers. She found the list of those who had requested safety measures upon burial. The families who had paid extra for cords, bell posts, and escape holes. Sarah Allerton, aged 19, cause, fevered wasting. Leah Finn, shoemaker, died, 1804, grave watcher. 23 names. She wrote each name in a soft-bound notebook. Next to them, she recorded where their graves were as best she could. Since many had shifted or vanished, then she took brass tags, little oval plates bought from a hardware store, and engraved each name by hand. She returned to the graveyard in spring. The grass was tall, the paths overgrown, but she walked them slowly, tying a tag to each grave post or where one had once stood. She spoke each name aloud. She didn't do it for any particular belief. Not out of fear or piety. She did it because she thought being remembered mattered, even if only by one person. Even if you had once paid for a bell on the chance you'd wake beneath the earth. Especially then, in her final years, Clara gave her notebook to the village library. It sat on a low shelf in the local history section. Most patrons walked past it. Some stopped and flipped through the names, and sometimes, very rarely, someone would pause at the graveyard gate and look toward the plot where Sarah Allerton had once been buried. They would wonder why there was a tiny hole beneath the headstone, filled now with earth and roots. They would wonder who had waited for a bell to ring, and perhaps, if the wind was very still, they would hear a faint jingle, not from a rope, not from below, but from memory, from a thought that perhaps we are never as alone in the dark as we fear, that someone once sat by our resting place, night after night, waiting to be sure we stayed asleep. And in that thought, there is something oddly comforting. A final watch, a final kindness, the kind of quiet care that rarely makes the history books, but lingers like the slow toll of a forgotten bell. In the hills north of York, where mist slips between moors like a forgotten promise and sheep still outnumber men, there lies a stretch of land that never grew crops. Even in spring, when the heather warms and the rivers unclench their ice, the patch remains still an undisturbed swell of earth, with no markers, no stones, no flowers, just grass and silence. To the villagers of Far Thistle, a name you won't find on many maps, that bump in the earth was always there. Children avoided it. Old women warned against playing near it. Dogs barked when passing, but few could tell you what it truly was. The land had grown quiet, and memory had let go of its grip. But there was a time, long before quiet came, when the ground there was open, raw, and gaping, when the air above it hummed with flies and grief, and when men with carts came each morning, bearing the wrapped shapes of those who had fallen overnight. The year was 1349. The plague had arrived. It did not knock, it did not announce itself. It swept. It had already blackened the ports Bristol, Southampton, Dover. The cities fell first, crumbling, not from siege, but from within. The priests couldn't bury fast enough. The bells rang and rang until no one pulled them anymore. But Far Thistle thought itself safe. Too small, they said, too far north. The fever won't reach the hills, and for a time they were right. The plague moved like a shadow of rumor, always one village over, always someone else's grief. Travelers brought tales, not symptoms. A merchant from Whitby warned of swollen buboes and breath that turned black. Friars spoke of entire families taken in a single night. But the people of Far Thistle shook their heads, crossed themselves, and continued on. They buried their dead, the usual kind. The ones taken by age, by harvest accidents, by childbirth. The churchyard held them all, neatly arranged in rows. The gravedigger, Tomas, knew each stone like a friend, but then a boy, the cooper's son, came down with a fever. He was 12, strong-limbed, full of questions. He was dead by morning, his mother by the next, and then it began at first. The deaths could still be named: the tanner, the smith's eldest daughter, the reeve's wife, each one wrapped and buried, within hours, with Tomas hurrying to keep up. But it was not enough. The plague did not wait. It took for one day, 9 the next. By the end of the week, the bell tolled 14 times in one morning. The churchyard filled. There were no more plots left, no space between stones. And the bodies kept coming. Tomas dug faster, but the ground fought him. Frost lingered, and his hands bled. The priest collapsed after his 4th funeral mass. No one came to ring the bell after that. The dead began piling near the church door. It was a midwife, an older woman named Gilda, who finally said what none dared to voice. "We need a pit," she murmured. And so, in the dead of night, by torchlight, 4 men took shovels and walked beyond the village's edge, past the stone wall, into the rough, common land that no one farmed. They dug until their hands blistered and the earth turned to clay. A long, wide trench, just deep enough to stack. They called it a plague hold. By morning, it held its first body. By dusk, its 10th. They did not bury with ceremony. There was no time for prayers. Each body, wrapped in sackcloth, often still warm, was laid beside the others, like firewood. The gravediggers stopped looking at faces. The priest, too weak to stand, sent blessings from his bed. The pit grew. Each day, a cart arrived with the dead, pulled by a mule, driven by silence. Soon, villagers stopped counting, and soon after, they stopped attending. Even the living avoided one another. Doors were shut. Meals were passed on long sticks. Words became whispers. Death had made them strangers. Yet the pit endured, a gruesome kindness. It offered a place when no other remained. It held those who would otherwise rot in alleys or behind cottage doors. It was, in its quiet horror, the last mercy. But something else began to happen. One morning, a cart driver, a boy of 17, named Merle, dropped a body into the pit and heard something. Not the thud of cloth on earth, but movement. A muffled sound, like breath, like struggle. He froze. Leaning over, he stared into the dark heap of bodies. Hey, and then, beneath the folds of sackcloth, a hand twitched. He jumped back, trembling, then climbed in. He tugged at the body, unwrapped the cloth, and found a man, blue-lipped, bloodied, but breathing, alive. The man had not been dead, just unconscious. His fever had broken in the night, and he had been mistaken for gone. Merle pulled him out. No one believed him at first. Then they saw the man walk, slow and stumbling, back into the village square, and the fear changed. The pit, the necessary mercy, had now almost swallowed the living. Suddenly, everyone was afraid of the pit in a new way. Whispers spread. What if we buried others who still breathe? What if the fever merely makes them still? What if the ones we laid yesterday? Tomas, the old gravedigger, said nothing. But that night, he returned to the pit, a lantern in one hand, a long stick in the other. He prodded each body, looked for breath, for signs. For a twitch, he found none, but he could not be sure. So, the villagers devised a plan. Before anyone was added to the pit, they would check, not just once, but twice. They would wait a few hours, watch for breath on a mirror, pinch fingers, call names. Only then would the body be taken. And Tomas added something else. He placed a thin cord tied to the wrist on one of the newest bodies, ran it up through the sackcloth out of the pit, and tied it to a tiny bell on a branch above. "If it rings," he said softly, "I'll come." Others began doing the same, not for everyone, but for those they feared might not be truly gone. It was not a widespread thing. No grand system, just chords and bells, quiet reminders. Tiny, hopeful escapes. None of them ever rang, but still they were tied. Weeks passed, then months. The death slowed. The cart stopped by autumn. The pit was full. They covered it with earth, sprinkled lime, planted grass, and did not mark it with stone or cross. Only memory. Tomas died 2 winters later. His final request: "Do not put me in the pit, but tie a cord, just in case." They did. His bell never rang. And yet, centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered that field near Far Thistle, digging gently into what they suspected was a plague burial, they found bodies stacked neatly, wrapped in cloth, and around a few skeletal wrists, they found frayed lengths of cord. No bells, but the cords were suspecting. For the cords were there, and even in death, that meant someone had tried. Someone had worried. Someone had loved enough to hope. Tomas, the gravedigger, had always known death in its most mundane form. Before the plague arrived, it had been slow, seasonal, and polite. An old man here, a child lost in winter fever, a mother worn from too many births. Death came in ones and twos, and Tomas had time to prepare, to dig, to mourn a little with each stroke of his spade. He'd pause, press his ear to the earth, sometimes hum old burial chants, and finish the job before the evening meal. But after the plague came, everything changed. The ground no longer had time to settle between burials. Grass had no chance to grow. Stones went uncarved, and Tomas's spade never left his hand. He slept in his boots, dirt under his nails, muscles trembling from endless work. He ate near the pit, with hands he could never quite get clean. Akita, in many ways, become an extension of the grave itself. But after the incident with the man who had not been dead, Tomas became something else entirely. The village watcher. He began arriving before the carts, not just to dig, but to observe. 4 hours each morning, Tomas would stand over the newest pile of bodies and wait. He would crouch ear near the wrappings, lips parted as if to whisper. Sometimes he pressed a mirror to the cloth. Times he waited for a twitch. He told no one what he heard or didn't hear. Simply waited, eyes heavy, expression unreadable, until he nodded once. Then, and only then, would he lower the dead into the plague pit. Villagers started calling him Tomas, the listener. They treated him differently, not with reverence, but with distance. There was something about a man who watched for movement in the dead that unsettled people. Children stopped speaking when he passed. Even the priest, who once drank ale with Tomas in the tavern, now offered blessings from across the street. But Tomas didn't mind. He had grown used to silence. In fact, he had started writing things down. Not letters, not names, but marks. A small stone near each new body he believed might not be quite gone. A scratch on the wood cart, soft etching on the church's outer wall. It wasn't superstition. Tomas did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in error. He had seen one man rise. That was enough. And though no bells had rung since, hint, none of the cords had twitched, he could not let the possibility go. This is how the practice spread. The watching period. A short wait before burial began, not only in Far Thistle, but in nearby hamlets. Villages adopted their own variations. Some would wait until sunset before interring a plague victim. Others insisted on 3 signs of death: cessation of breath, limp limbs, the presence of livor mortis, although few knew the term, only the color. The fear of burying the living took hold, almost as strongly as the fear of death itself. In some cases, the fear went further. A few wealthier towns began building what would later be called mort houses, cold stone shelters, often with iron doors, where the bodies of the recently deceased were placed for a day or more before burial. These were, in a sense, the early ancestors of modern morgues. Some were watched, some were locked. All of them, in essence, were spaces of waiting for certainty. But Far Thistle had no mort house, no iron gates, just Tomas in the pit, and the cords. Sometimes a mother would bring one frayed from a curtain, or a husband would twist a ribbon around his wife's wrist. The ends would be tied to a stick, to a bell, to a bent iron nail hung above the pit. It was a crude system, but a caring one, and care in those days was the rarest thing. By now, the village had lost over half its population. Kana, the bells in the church tower were silent. The priest had died in his sleep, rosary clutched tight. The tavern had shuttered. The children no longer played in the lanes. There were fewer carts, fewer prayers, fewer weddings. But the pit remained, and so did Tomas. One afternoon, while crouched by the edge of the burial trench, Tomas saw something that didn't make sense. A hand, not moving, not twitching, but open, palm up. The hand belonged to a girl of about 10, wrapped in linen. Her form was nearly indistinct, but her fingers were spread in a way that suggested she had not gone easily. Most of the dead were curled, pulled inward by fever and final breath. But this child had died. Reaching, Tomas paused. He placed a mirror near her face. No breath. He pressed a warm stone to her chest. No rise. Still, the hand. He did not bury her that day. Instead, he carried her back to the small chapel, placed her on the table where offerings once rested. He sat beside her all night, watching. In the morning, she had not moved. Her skin had cooled further. Her lips were darker. And so, the next night, he buried her, but not before tying a cord, leaving her hand uncovered, palms still open to the sky. No one ever asked him why. They didn't need to. By the following week, Tomas had developed a new system. Before burial, each body received 3 things: a linen wrap, a cord tied to the wrist or ankle, a chalk mark placed gently on the forehead, 1, 2, or 3 lines, depending on how certain he felt the person was dead. 1 line meant he was sure, 2 meant he had doubts, 3 meant he hoped he was wrong. The villagers saw the marks and began assigning meaning. They told stories of Tomas seeing souls, of the marks preventing spirits from wandering, of chalk guiding the dead to peace. But Tomas never explained. Thomas never explained. He didn't need to. It wasn't for them. It was for the dead and for himself. Winter came harsh that year. Snow blanketed the pit. The cords froze in place. The bells were heavy with frost. Tomas covered them with cloth, trying to muffle the wind's false alarms. And in January, for the first time since the plague arrived, no one died. For 1 week, then 2, and then the cart stopped coming altogether. People began to breathe again. The market reopened. Children's voices returned to the fields. The bells in the tower rang again, not for death, but for mass. But Tomas did not leave the pit. He kept visiting. Every morning, he swept the snow from the frozen cords. He tapped the bells with his finger, and then he sat. He had become a kind of guardian, not of the dead, but of the memory of what had happened, and of what had nearly been buried alive. One morning in March, a woman from the next village over arrived, looking for her sister, who had vanished months ago. Tomas remembered her. A quiet seamstress, left the first wrapped in cord, 1 chalk line. The woman stood beside the pit and whispered thanks, and then she pressed a bell into Tomas's hand. a small one, finely crafted with a copper tongue. For the next, she said. He nodded. He hung it that evening. There would be no next. The pit would remain sealed, but the bell stayed anyway as a symbol, or perhaps a warning, depending on who visited. Centuries later, during restoration efforts near what had become a sheep field with no name, archaeologists discovered the burial trench. Most bones were jumbled. Several showed signs of careful placement. Wrists still bore remnants of linen cord, and nearby, in the soil, fragments of bells, copper, iron, even one of silver, were uncovered. One scholar, writing about the site in a dusty journal no one much reads anymore, noted the presence of chalk residue on a handful of skulls. No carvings, no inscriptions, just faint white marks. 1 line, 2, 3. They were not symbols of death. They were signs of hesitation, of someone who looked a little longer, of someone who wasn't quite sure. It would be easy to forget Tomas in the centuries that followed. After all, he left no descendants, wrote no books, carved no lasting stone. He had no trade beyond digging, no formal office in the village. His name was not recorded in the parish register beyond a single mention. Tomas, servant of the dead, presumed lost to fever. But Tomas's chalk system lived on, not officially, not formally, but in the quiet habits of gravediggers, clerics, and midwives who came after Dot in nearby villages. Whispers of the third mark took on a superstitious quality among the old folk of North Yorkshire. It was said that drawing 3 lines on a forehead could delay death, or at least confuse it. For a while in the 1400s, there was even a local custom of drawing chalk lines on newborns. 1, if they cried quickly. 2, if they did not. And 3, if the breath refused to come. A strange misinterpretation, no doubt. But traditions rarely evolve in straight lines. Meanwhile, in the churchyards themselves, other signs of Tomas's influence began to appear. One graveyard in the village of Gormla had a strange little hut built in its corner, often mistaken for a shed. In truth, it was a crude watching chamber. Local lore claimed the structure had once housed a man who did not sleep, who waited 3 nights beside each fresh grave to be certain the occupant did not stir. The chamber even had a slit in its roof, not for light, but for the sound of bells. If any rope twitched from beneath the earth, bell hanging from the rafter above would tremble, and the sound would pass down to the man sleeping below. We do not know his name, but inside the hut, carved faintly into the wooden lintel, were the markings. 3 lines, 3 judgments, 3 moments of waiting. There are records from the nearby city of York in the 1470s that mention a pause day for plague victims, an unofficial period of delay before burial, especially for those who had died at home without clerical witness. Though the city never codified the practice, many poorer wards followed it. This too may have been a distant echo of Tomas's vigil in the moorland hamlets. The tradition shifted again. Their villagers began using tiny bells sewn into burial shrouds, not ropes, not cords, but direct attachments. Women would stitch them into the fabric near the hands, others at the base of the spine. The bells were no larger than thimbles, and often homemade, fashioned from scrap or coins hammered thin. Some bore inscriptions, "If you wake, ring." Others had only symbols, a cross, a line, a spiral. It said that even long after the Black Death had waned, even after better physicians and anatomy texts became widespread, a few older women still kept chalk by their bedsides, just in case their families needed to mark them before the final rest. Not out of fear, but out of caution, out of a strange respect for those caught and dashed between by the late 1500s. The practice of tying cords to the dead had mostly vanished in England. The cords were seen as crude, unnecessary. Medicine had improved. Burials became more ritualized. with faster turnarounds, stricter supervision, and rising costs. But the memory of the bells lingered in stories, in song, in the names of inns and alleyways. There is an old drinking ballad from the north called The Bell That Rang Below, which speaks of a man whose voice was stolen by death, yet who found his way back by ringing through the clay. The song is mostly comic now, but it hints at a deeper folklore, one that feared not just death, but being forgotten beneath the earth. And so, slowly, the figure of the bell ringer, the chalk watcher, the trench listener, all blurred into a legend. In some places, he was a ghost; in others, a saint; in others still, a warning. In fact, 17th century children's rhyme from Leeds describes Old Tom the Chalk Man as a figure who visits disobedient children at night, checking their foreheads for signs of breath. They're sleeping too. Soundly, he draws 3 lines and carries them to the cold below. It's dark, yes, but it's also a memory, somewhere, the deep roots of collective recollection. Tomas remained, not as a man, but as a symbol of caution, of waiting, of the sacredness of that strange moment when life may still be clinging, silent and unsure. By the 1800s, English antiquarians began rediscovering reports of safety coffins, more elaborate than cords and bells. Cods had internal mechanisms. Some had periscopes. Others had strings that connected to flags or whistles above ground. These inventions are often credited to German and French engineers, but the English had their own. One particular drawing, dated 1842, shows a coffin designed in Yorkshire with a bell, of course, and a carved motto on the lid, "Not yet." It's unclear whether the bell ever rang, but that phrase alone, "not yet," echoes the entire spirit of Tomas's work, a refusal to rush death, a willingness to wait, a belief that certainty is not too much to ask, even in the depths of fear. Modern archaeologists examining plague pits from the 14th century sometimes find odd things among the bones. A bell here, a coil of cord there, bits of chalk that have long since fused with limestone. Few of these findings make headlines. Most are cataloged, logged, and forgotten. But every so often, someone writes a note in the margin, chalk mark, 3 lines. And even in the sterile context of a museum drawer, that phrase is enough to cause pause. What were they waiting for? What did they fear? What did they hope? Today, few graveyards have cords or bells. There are no watchers beside open trenches. There are, instead, machines, tests, doctors. Death is more certain now, or so we believe. But the fear of premature burial remains a potent one. It appears in fiction, in horror films, in superstitions whispered at the edge of sleep. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Tomas. Not the chalk, not the bell, but the WATCHFULNESS, the pause, the willingness to wait one moment longer, because beneath all our rituals, our rites, our prayers, our systems of death, there is still the echo of a man kneeling beside a pit, listening for movement, breath, or sound. A man who had seen one hand reach, one body twitch, and because of that, could never again bury the dead in haste. It begins not with the grave, but with the church door, a thick, groaning slab of oak banded in iron, its hinges twisted with centuries of rust and ritual. At first glance, it's just another medieval church entrance, the kind you might find in the lowland counties of England or northern France. But as your eyes adjust to the stone quiet of the nave, and you take your first tentative steps forward, something feels wrong. The floor beneath you tilts subtly, not because of age, but design. The stone slabs are gently arched, sloping downward, toward the altar, as though to invite water, or to contain it. In the dimness, the pews seem narrower than usual and closer to the ground. A faint iron scent lingers near the chancel, sharp and metallic like blood left along on cold tools. Then you reach the altar itself. The stone is rough-hewn. It's older than the rest of the building. Its base is rimmed with small, square insets, like ventilation grates. But these are not for air. You kneel, peer closer, and see that behind the grate is nothing, a void, a shaft that descends into utter blackness. This, in some parts of Europe, is called the Hold Sanctum, the Sanctified Vault, but others gave it darker names: the Church Lock, the Silent Pit, or simply the Second Door. And it was here, beneath the very altar where Mass was said and sacraments performed, that the bodies no one trusted were placed. Not criminals, mind you, not the excommunicated or the forsaken. No, this chamber was for those who died strangely, too quickly, too quietly, with too few signs, or with signs that might have meant more. It was for the maybe dead. For centuries, most churches buried their dead in consecrated ground just outside the nave, in small plots divided by wealth or status. Children near the southern wall, wealthy; patrons close to the bell tower; lepers tucked into corners behind hedges. But in certain regions, particularly in 13th and 14th century, Languedoc and parts of Flanders, a separate burial practice began to emerge. It involved not soil, but stone; not final rest, but prolonged waiting. The rationale was never publicly declared, but old records hint at an unsettling possibility that death could lie, that breath might hide, that illness might mimic the stillness of the grave. And so, the Church, ever cautious in both miracle and medicine, created the vault. These burial vaults, usually set beneath or behind altars, were lined in lime-washed stone and partially ventilated to the outside air. They were accessed via narrow staircases sealed behind iron doors, or, in some cases, hidden beneath choir stalls inside. Long stone ledges awaited the newly dead bodies, laid out not for eternity, but for delay, for observation. Church records from 1312 in the Diocese of Béziers mention the burial of one Henry de Vere, aged 42, who had fallen as if in sleep, without illness. He was placed in the Hold Sanctum of Saint Michel d'As. His burial mass was delayed by 3 days. When priests returned to conduct the rite, they found the stone vault door cracked, and Henry's hand bloodied against the inside wall. His fingernails had broken. After that, the vault door was reinforced. No records exist of compensation or apology. This incident, and others like it, were not uncommon. Across rural Europe, stories accumulated of the dead who woke in the nave. Dark. Some were exhumed for suspicion of heresy or undeath. Others were simply found in terrible postures, twisted, clawing, mouths agape as if mid-scream. And so, some clergy began to place precautions inside the vaults. Iron rings were installed above the stone slabs. 10 ropes were tied to wrists, attached. 2 bells or hammers above. In one church in Bruges, an elaborate pulley system was constructed, designed to let a body that shifted raise a weighted flag in the courtyard. All this, mind you, was kept from the parishioners. No sermons mentioned the vault. No, its funerals acknowledged the extra days. Only the oldest sacristans and the grave watchers, men who earned barely a loaf for their silence, knew the truth. They sat in the vestries at night, ears tuned to stone, fingers twitching over prayer beads as they listened, not for God, but for scratching. We have accounts from one such watcher in the parish of St. Felix in Montpellier. A man named Jourdain served as grave watch from 1289 to 1307. His ledger, preserved in the church archives, reads more like a journal of dread than a record of wages. In it, he notes 17 separate incidents where movement was heard below. He wrote, plainly, 3 bells rang this week. 1 ceased within minutes. F. The second gave no further noise. But the third continued. I fetched the deacon. We descended. The man inside was awake, his mouth torn from shouting. Jourdain received no commendation, only new rope and instructions to watch more closely. By the late 14th century, as plague and famine swept the land, the use of vaults increased. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed ordinary graveyards. In many towns, the vaults beneath churches became crowded, not with the restless dead, but with fearful ones. People began to ask to be placed inside, not from fear of burial, but from fear of being buried wrongly. We have a letter from a merchant's wife in 1371, addressed to her children. If I should seem to die in sleep, do not bury me at once. Beg the priest to keep me below for 3 nights. Say prayers. Watch. If I wake, I shall surely knock. Some priests obliged. Others refused, citing time, or smell, or the risk of rumor. A few churches developed formal 3-day rites, periods of vigil before full burial. Bodies were placed in the hold sanctum, but not declared dead until the final night passed in stillness. Families would light candles above, and sometimes sing softly into the floor lullabies, prayers or chants meant to ease a soul to rest or wake it. The practice was not universal, but where it was followed, fewer were buried alive. Of course, no one could fully measure how many lives were saved, or how many might have been had the practice spread farther by the 15th century. As anatomy advanced and the church grew more centralized, the vaults began to vanish. Not demolished, merely repurposed. Some became ossuaries, others wine cellars. A few were sealed entirely, their iron doors removed, their secrets forgotten. But in the quietest churches, those untouched by war or reform, traces remain. A scratch here, bell hung oddly from a ceiling beam, stone slab too smooth for ordinary flooring dot, and once, in a chapel in southern Belgium, a small inscription was found carved into the inside of a disused vault door. It read, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." The archaeologist who discovered it took a rubbing, cataloged the slab, and moved on. No further analysis was made, but the words still echo, don't they? Because what if you'd lived then? What if your body, slown from fever, silent with cold, was mistaken for lifeless? What if the priest said your last words and the door closed over your head? Would you ring the bell? Would you scream? Would you lie still, hoping for someone like Jourdain to hear? Or would you carve those final words into stone? Not yet, not yet, not yet. Long before forensic medicine made its way into universities, there were the watchers. They did not wear robes or gold crosses. They held no books of law or science. Most could not read at all, but they knew the difference between silence and death, or at least they tried to. These men, sometimes women, were known only as watchers, the unofficial sentinels of the dead. They worked in the lowest corners of the church's employment hierarchy, often paid in scraps or lodging, almost never mentioned in records beyond their wages. They were not mourners or undertakers or monks. They were listeners. Their duty was not to bury the dead, but to confirm them. And in churches where vault burials were practiced, where the maybe dead were laid beneath the stone floors for 2, 3, or even 7 days, the watchers became indispensable, but they were never named. We do not know the name of the woman who stood each dusk outside the hold sanctum at the Church of St. Blaise in what is now northern Spain, placing her ear to the floor for 10 minutes before lighting the altar candles. We do not know the name of the young novice who was ordered to sleep beside the trapdoor in the Cathedral of Aix-en-Provence in 1324, instructed to wake the canon only if the brass bell rang twice in succession. Scarce, but we do know their presence was real and feared, for in many parishes, the watcher was treated not as a guardian, but a reminder, a figure to be pitied or pitied from afar. There is a quiet cruelty in that, to stand each night with the responsibility of distinguishing final rest from temporary stillness, and to do so alone, without tools or training. No stethoscopes, no EKGs, no formal system of pulse checking. The medieval church had rituals, not metrics. And so, watchers relied on breath, on warmth, on twitching fingers or shifting eyes, on sounds. Above all, scratching. In time, scratching became a signal, both feared and hoped for. If heard, it meant a mistake had been made. A person had been buried too soon. But it also meant the person might yet be alive, might yet be saved. The architecture of the vaults often made this sound faint. The stone walls muffled vibrations. The wood of the trapdoors absorbed light movements. So, certain tricks were adopted. Dust was scattered across the vault floors, flour or ash, so that footprints might be seen when the doors were opened. Thin strings tied to fingers or feet were threaded up through ceiling holes and connected to suspended feathers or light chimes. But those who could not afford such measures relied solely on the watcher. One notable case comes from the parish of Saint Cyr in Avignon in 1353 during a harsh winter. The parish received the body of a traveler, unnamed, sickly, found collapsed in the road. No relatives came forward. The priest, following protocol, requested the body be placed in the vault. The watcher, that week, was a man named Etienne. His logbook survives in partial form. Each night, he noted only this: stillness, stillness, stillness. But on the fourth night, a different entry: noise, just past vespers, soft, rhythmic, then ceased. He did not alert the priest. He waited, unsure. By morning, he returned to the vault, opened it. Inside, the man's body was curled, face down, one hand bloodied. Etienne recorded, eyes open, expression not peaceful. After that, Etienne's name vanishes from the record. Some say he was dismissed. Others claim he left the city. Whatever the truth, the watchers learned a difficult lesson. To wait too long was to seal a tomb too tightly in some towns. The role of watcher was formalized. Instructions were copied into monastic rulebooks. In the monastery at Cluny, there were 3 duties listed for the novice assigned to the sanctum: check breath, test limb, listen for movement. But even so, human error remained. There is something haunting in how little power these watchers had. They were witnesses to doubt, to the slowness of death. They saw bodies change, relax, or stiffen, or tremble, and could only guess which change meant finality. Sometimes rigor mortis was mistaken for awakening. Sometimes a twitch was just that, a twitch. And in the silence of a church at 2 a.m, every sound seemed louder than it was. One of the more tragic tales comes from Lübeck in present-day Germany. In 1408, a merchant's daughter named Enke fell ill with a fever that left her nearly unresponsive. She was declared dead and, according to custom, laid in the church vault for 3 days. The watcher on the second night was a 14-year-old boy, newly apprenticed. He later claimed to have heard weeping from below. He ran to tell the priest. The priest scolded him for superstition. By morning, Enke was silent again. She was buried. A week later, her brother bribed the sexton to exhume her. Her fingers were broken. There were scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid. The boy was never seen again. In some places, these stories gave rise to community demands. People began writing instructions to their survivors. Leave me 3 days, or place a bell beside me. Some wealthier individuals went further, commissioning mechanical caskets with latches that could be opened from within, or mausoleums with escape hatches. These were expensive luxuries and mostly ornamental, but they reflected a growing anxiety, not of death, but of mistaken death, and that anxiety rippled outward, shaping superstition and law alike. One French town in 1421 required that every person be buried with a stone in their hand, the theory being that should they awake, they could drop it, and the sound would alert a passerby. Another town banned premature burial altogether, mandating 5 full days before interment. But the cost of keeping the body and the risk of decomposition made this difficult, so the churches kept relying on watches. There were, by now, some who took pride in the role. Elderly men, often former gravediggers, who had seen more than their share of death. They developed a kind of sixth sense, watching not for signs of life, but for lack of signs altogether. A truly dead body, they said, was always still in a certain way. It didn't fidget, didn't stretch, didn't seem to hold breath. And so they watched. One such man, named Jan Veer, kept vigil for 17 years in a small chapel outside Lyon. His records are plain, nearly poetic in their repetition. Each page begins with the date, the weather, the time he sat. Then only 3 words: no sound tonight, till one night in 1443. Storm overhead, thunder shaking beams, but from below, under the vault, a tap. Not a mouse, not a shifting stone, a tap, then a pause, then another. He opened the vault. Young man, barely 20, was awake, terrified, weak, live. That man went on to live another 47 years, married, had children, taught at a church school, and every year on the date of his mistaken burial, he returned to that chapel, placed a loaf and wine at the altar, and left without a word. There were no ceremonies for the watchers, no stained glass windows, no relics or songs. Their names, mostly, have faded, their work hidden beneath the loud rituals of liturgy. But they stood, night after night, in cold chapels, listening to stone. They did not heal, okay? They did not pray. They simply waited for silence, or for scratching. It was a sound no one wanted to hear, a faint jingle, almost imagined, soft clinking in the middle of the night, when no breeze stirred, when the dead were supposed to rest and the earth was still. A bell, tied to nothing visible, responding, not to weather a hand, but to movement below. By the late 15th century, the medieval church was no longer the only institution bearing its own. Merchants had their own crypts. Noble families built side chapels and private tombs, often with complex systems of ventilation. But in rural villages, and even in some major cathedral towns, the dead still rested in simple wooden boxes or stone vaults. And the fear of being buried too soon persisted. So came the age of the safety bell. It began not in superstition, but in desperation. Some say the first was designed by a watchmaker in Dresden, whose young wife was presumed dead after a fever. Too poor to afford a mausoleum and too frightened to bury her quickly, he devised a system, a small brass bell mounted on a flexible rod, connected by a thread that ran down into the coffin, where it was attached to her finger. She awoke, moved, the bell rang, and she was saved. No one knows whether the story is entirely true, but by 1487, such devices, crude as they were, had spread. The French called them cloche de la peur, the bell of fear. The English simply called them grave bells. Most were not elaborate: a bent rod, a bell, a pulley or hook, akin. Wealthier parishes, iron stands were added with small wheels to support tension. In poorer areas, thread was replaced with horsehair or even long vines, but the principle remained the same. A movement below should make a sound above. The dead should be heard. The living should listen, and the watchers, once lone figures sitting in shadows, now had help. In some towns, the bell rope passed not just to a surface bell, but into a vestry chamber where it was connected to a small latch. If pulled, it would drop a stone or raise a flag. In one bizarre case from 1504, a monastery in Poland installed a lever system that activated a water clock and sent droplets onto a sheet of stretched leather, producing a rhythmic knocking sound. This entire arrangement was called taphonomic signaling, though that term came centuries later. At the time, it was simply seen as good insurance. For a few extra coins, you could be buried with a line to the sky. But bells began to ring, not every day, not every month, but enough. In the abbey at St. Julian, 3 bells rang in 1 year. Of those 2 were false alarms, one caused by soil shifting, another likely by animals disturbing the grave mound. But the third, a young boy, barely 12, he had collapsed during a flood and was presumed drowned. He wasn't. He had shallow breathing, a slowed pulse, signs of hypothermia, not fully understood at the time. Placed in the family crypt, he lay still for nearly a full day, then stirred. His finger twitched. The thread tugged. The bell rang. The sexton heard it. Opened the vault. The boy survived. He became a novice monk 2 years later, and eventually rose to be abbot of the very abbey that had nearly buried him alive. Such stories, while rare, kept the bell tradition alive. By 1510, bell mechanisms became more advanced. Some included small hand cranks the buried could turn. Others used mirrors and lenses, early optics, to reflect light from a torch into the tomb, which, if broken or dimmed, might indicate movement. But bells remained the preferred method. Simple, audible, human. There are church records in Norfolk, England, that refer to restringing the repose bell each autumn as if it were as routine as mending a fence. In Germany, a brief fashion emerged among wealthier families to engrave small plaques with the words, "If I wake, I shall ring." Still, for every bell that rang and saved a life, there were dozens that did not. Some bells rusted, some threads broke. In many cases, the buried never awoke. Their deaths were real, their interments correct, but the bell was there, a symbol of vigilance, a message to the divine and to doubt itself. I may not be gone. One chronicler in Bologna, writing in 1531, recounts an odd moment during a heat wave. The church grounds had grown so dry that the soil compacted, pulling at the tension lines of several grave bells. Over a 2-night span, no fewer than 6 bells rang, 3 simultaneously. Panic followed. The sexton, overwhelmed, refused to open the graves at first. Townspeople insisted. Priests debated scripture. Eventually, all 6 graves were exhumed. All 6 were undisturbed. Dry earth had fooled the system, and so new rules were added. Bells must be tested weekly, threads replaced, graves monitored after storms or drought. The role of the watcher evolved into bell guardian, and, for a short time, in parts of Bavaria and Saxony, bell guardians were granted small pensions by the parish. Their job was to wait, to tend the dead and the maybe dead. But even with these safeguards, the fear could not be banished. An anonymous poem, dated 1542, and found scribbled in the margins of a sermon book in Ghent, reads, "Tie me a thread, O brother of mine, so that when I stir in the clay, some soul may hear, and know the sign that I was not meant for today." By the mid-16th century, these practices began to intersect with early medical knowledge. Scholars and alchemists alike began investigating the nature of death. Was it immediate? Is there a moment the soul left? Or did it linger? Could the body appear dead while life remained? Such questions, once the realm of theologians, now attracted surgeons, philosophers, even astrologers, and the bells became part of the evidence. One physician in Krakow kept detailed records of every grave bell that rang in his town over a 10-year span. He noted time of day, burial conditions, temperature, soil type, and even phases of the moon. His conclusion: most rings occurred within 30 hours of burial. After that, the thread likely rotted or the movement ceased. he published a short pamphlet with a title that translated roughly to On the Lingering of Life. In it, he proposed a radical idea that the definition of death might not be fixed, and that the church should consider extending the watch period to at least 3 days. His work was dismissed, but years later, his ideas resurfaced, quietly influencing burial policies in some Protestant regions, and all the while, the bells waited, silent, still, until one night they moved. There's a final story, half legend, passed down in whispers. In the parish of Saint Michel in rural France, a woman, Marguerite, had died suddenly during childbirth. No midwife had arrived. Her body was prepared and placed in the family crypt. Her husband, grief-stricken, refused to leave the church. He sat by her grave all night, just after midnight. The bell rang. He heard it, opened the vault. She was alive, weak, dazed, clutching a bundle. The child had survived, too. They both lived. The villagers called it a miracle. But Marguerite, when asked, said something else. I felt a thread on my finger. I moved it. I prayed someone had tied the other end to the world. And for a moment, they had.